And I would be worried if I'm a coal miner or a manufacturer of a BTG equipment or any of these, because I see that cost economics seriously going against them. It's not about world wanting to be clean. It's more about cost economics. And I think the cost economics is clearly moving against them.
Welcome to Asia Climate Finance, your front row seat to the policies, investments, and actors shaping climate business and finance across Asia Pacific. Subscribe now so others find this essential guide to Asia's climate economy, and note the disclaimers at the end. Now over to the host, analyst, investor, and author, Joseph Jacobelli.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be listening from. Welcome to Asia Climate Finance. Indian companies are making net zero pledges at a breathtaking pace. But how many are real and how many are just clever PR? Today we cut through the noise and whether the greenwashing era is finally over and why coal is quietly losing the one battle it can't win, the one over cost. My guest is Arun Kumar of Asia Research and Engagement. 3 decades in the field, he sits where the pressure gets applied between the boardrooms making the calls and the investors holding them to account. If you got an idea, write to us at acfpod@outlook.com, also at the top of the show notes. Enjoy the show. Hey Arun, it's really brilliant to have you on. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you so much.
So before we get started into big questions around Indian industry and net zero, I'd really love for you to tell us a little bit about your own journey into this space, and also tell us a little bit about Asia Research and Engagement and where it sits, because I think it sits actually at quite an interesting intersection of financial market and sustainability. So what was it that drew you personally to the energy transition as a focus, and how did that shape the work you now do with investors across the region, Arun?
Thanks, Joseph. First of all, let me congratulate you on this journey of 89 episodes. I remember we first talked in early years, many years back, I guess, and this has been doing great. I've heard some of the very good interviews which you have been conducted. So first of all, congratulations to you.
Thank you, Arun. Thank you.
Regarding my journey, I have got almost like 3 decades of experience working in space of energy, initially as a management consultant, then as equity analyst, where we both worked briefly together. And then actually getting to the industry and being a power trader for almost a decade. And so Asia Research and Engagement, when this assignment came in, this like amalgamation of all the experiences which I've gathered to date, the work which ARE or Asia Research and Engagement does, our mandate is to work across Asia. So we work across most of the major economies of Asia, including India and China, the leading ones. And the theory of change. So we have 2 platforms, energy transition and food transition. I work as a part of the energy transition platform. The theory of change which we have is that we think that the larger corporates can drive the biggest change, because the major part of the capital is being allocated by these large companies, which are primarily the listed ones. And the top listed one companies will make a huge impact if energy transition goals are to be achieved. And one of the ways to make that happen or accelerate that process is using the leverage of investors' pressure. So many of the large funds are part of our platform, which either proactively are part of our platform, or sometimes they may not be officially part of the platform, but are engaging with us. So we bring the engagement between the companies and the investors to facilitate the change. Sometimes the change is more about dialogue, more about asking some more questions, improving the disclosures. The whole objective is about improving the quality of transition decisions. So investors allocating more capital towards companies which are taking transition decisions, companies deploying more capital towards projects which are getting more and more transition driven, and policymakers shaping the incentives better. So all these 3 put together is the theory which we think will bring the major change in the energy transition, which is anyway happening. It's not that it's something which we will make it happen, but we only want to smoothen the process, accelerate the process, and in a right sense. So that's the role which ARE plays. I am part of the energy transition, so I am working with, at this point in time, mostly focusing on the Indian companies, but potentially we can work across Asia as a part of the ARE team.
And I wanted to also highlight that you've got a fantastic background, not just from the perspective that you work for banks, so you've got that financial side of things, but you also worked in corporations, so you've got that side of things as well. And in addition, don't want to praise you too much, Arun. We're good friends. I don't want to praise you too much in public, but you also have a very unique view because you're not just an India specialist, and you really have a very broad view of how what's happening in India fits in with the rest of Asia, with the rest of the world. So I think it's really, really great asset, and it's really great to have you on the podcast. If I can move on to some kind of high-level questions, Arun, about the Indian industry net zero. So the first one is that Indian companies have been making net zero pledges at a pretty striking pace over the last few years, right? When you step back and look at the overall picture, personally, how genuine do you think this movement actually is, and what's actually driving it beyond the obvious public relations optics?
Good question and good skepticism about what the companies are saying. But since we're working deeply with the companies, I think this stage of net zero commitment, which was happening since 5-6 years back, and which could be called greenwashing, is no more the case. Today, I just came off the AGM of Tata Power, and all I can tell you, the conversation inside the boardroom is much more commercial. They are asking questions will that affect our access to the export market? Will the investors value us differently? Will our cost of capital change if we don't factor that into our capital deployment? Can we secure an affordable renewable power to replace the fossil? Can we make RE round the clock? So this is a question which is a commercial question which boardrooms are today discussing. And the company management is telling the shareholders that we want to be net zero by 2045. This is what the management said to the shareholders today in the AGM. So this is no more a question which was just as a PR optics, because if the company is making a commitment and also backing up with a credible plan. So at ARE, we are not just looking at what is the net zero commitment date. What we're looking at is what is the investment decision which the declared companies make following the net zero commitment which they have taken. I'll give you an example. I attended another AGM, Tata Steel. Now, Tata Steel is the first company which has started deploying the electric arc furnace in India. India traditionally has been coal-based blast furnaces used in steel manufacturing. But they have recently started the first pilot in Ludhiana. And during the AGM, they said that while they have a lithium operation, which is going to be fully electric arc furnace, but they're also going to add 2 million tons of additional capacity in India. So the point they're making to the investors is that it makes good business sense. But at the same time, they're also careful. They're not saying that entire investment is going towards green steel. They're also saying that if the demand picks up, they will definitely put more money. But at this point in time, we are looking at it in a very favorable way, and we are putting money there. So if you're putting money where mouth lies, I guess that's the credibility of that announcement of energy transition. And when we look at it, when we evaluate and compare companies, this is what we will look at primarily. What is the investment decision, how the management is telling the shareholders, what they actually, are they answering the question if a shareholder is asking that? Or are they disclosing in their annual reports about what kind of investment decisions they will take in future? So I think we have moved away from that greenwashing phase to a more credible commercial phase of energy transition.
No, it's really good that you put a little bit of color on that, mentioning Tata Power and Tata Steel. Now, a lot of the corporations, Indian corporations' commitments come with target years like 2050 or 2070 that are far enough away that the people actually making the announcements won't actually be accountable for them, right? So how should investors and civil society be pressure testing these pledges today rather than waiting decades to find out if they were serious. And I guess you already partly answered the question by mentioning those two examples, but do you have any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's where probably they need to seek people like ARE as partners, because that's where we do the detailing is where the challenge is, because step zero is, of course, announcement of a net zero target. Many companies haven't announced that. So we don't consider that as that's an important announcement. So we'll take that as step zero. And that is something from where we'll start. But at the same time, two companies may have announced a net zero target, but we will go beyond. We will look at what is the capital which they're allocating each year. Each year, company announces the capital investment for that particular year. Where is the capital going? Where is the money being put to test? Because what has been built has been built. What we're looking at, where is the future money going to flow into? Are they going to flow to the greener investments? What is the interim milestone? So 2070 or 2050 could be the target, but do they have a 2030 target which looks credible at this point in time? Who is the management accountable for? Is the chairman accountable for it, or if there is a insignificant person accountable for it? What are they telling the shareholders? Which technologies they are looking to invest in? What are the assumptions behind the whole policy and carbon prices? So what is the management commentary on the carbon pricing, on the technology evolution? And all this put together, when we do our research at a company level, we get a fair picture about the company's commitment. And that's how we compare companies also. Sometimes both companies may have the same net zero target date, but when we write the report of this analysis, and that's why our kind of analysis is very important, especially from investors' perspective, is that they should look at these companies more favorably when they are allocating capital towards buying the shares of these companies. And I think this is a space which is very important, because you're right, the far off target is very hard to really comprehend for a common investor from a very distressed.
Right. A recurring tension in these conversations is between what Indian industry needs to stay competitive globally and what the science actually says needs to happen on timelines. When those two things conflict, which one tends to win inside the boardroom in India? Is it the money side of things, or is it looking at more the longer term side of things?
I mean, of course, the shareholders will be asking for a good EBITDA and good PAT. As we all know, we have been equity analysts, so we understand that. But the good news is that now the decarbonization is no more seen as a cost. It is seen as something which you need to do to be competitive. Today, for example, round the clock, renewable energy is going to be cheaper than the new coal power plant. And also the investors are going to ask, which are the companies which have a credible transition plan? And global capital will definitely, because yesterday only there was an article by Bloomberg, and the whole investment in the energy, which includes power and oil and gas, in last decade, 15 to 20, 25, there is a clear shift from fossil to non-fossil, a huge shift. So what was 60%, and this is across. So in fact, the interesting analysis which Bloomberg did was the private capital is primarily moving towards greener investment. Most of the fossil investment is still done by the governments using the taxpayers' money, because obviously that the returns are not that primary. Maybe energy security, geopolitics is driving that decision. But the key point about the companies is that if the companies do not take that decarbonization investment decision, they are likely to be non-competitive going forward. So when they're looking in future, the companies think that this is no more a choice. But at the same time, if the technology is not proven, if they have to run their businesses, they still tend to have some capital or significant part of the capital being allocated to not so clean investments.
Right. I've got a follow-up question still kind of on the landscape side of things. In your experience, do you feel that the average, let's talk about large size Indian corporation, is fully factoring in both climate physical risk as well as climate transition risk? Is that, apart from pressure from investors and shareholders, do they feel that that's also a pressure, or we're not quite there yet? I guess physical risk is, heat waves and floods and those things are pretty much recognized by large, medium, and even small corporations. But what about the transition risk? We're talking about the potential legal liabilities, technological change, market change, and so on and so forth. Do you feel that as part of their transition plans, they're on top of this or not?
I would say that it's a mix. Its answer is it's a mix. So the larger corporations, let's say, I talk about the Tata Group, running or JSW, the larger groups, do they have a team already in place to actually take that into consideration? But I would be very honest, in India, that's still early days. It's not that it is fully factored into the investment decision. It is not that the management time or a chairman's of the company time is going to be spent on that. At this point in time, it has not reached at the board level in a sense that it is discussed as a one-day discussion on the particular climate risk. But we are moving in that direction. Given the geopolitics, given what has happened over the last, say, 2 months, 3 months of this crisis in the Middle East, people are realizing that it is not only the climate risk, also the energy risk. The fossil as an energy source is at risk. And energy security is something which is of prime importance. And energy can come through cleaner ways and through the more not so clean ways. They were more worried about the least cost energy. And probably the governments are still a little bit more focusing on security, but companies are more focused on the cost of energy. We'll gradually see that factoring of climate risk and the physical as well as the other transition risk getting into the decision making. It's a continuum, varies from company to company. But the bigger the companies, many companies have that factored into their plan. Gradually, that is getting incorporated in the whole capital. So basically, the first point when we look at it as ARE is that where is the capital being allocated? So this year's capital and next year's capital, we'll compare it. Has that been impacted? And our goal is that. For example, one of the factors which we are looking at is that can the company say no new coal policy? Can the power companies announce that? Tata Power has done that. Tata Power is the only company which has done that in India. No other company has done it. But that's our wish list. We are expecting that 2032, 2033, because at some point in future, we will definitely expect the companies to come with that kind of an announcement. And we're seeing that gradually in process.
Right, because I think that's really important for investors, right? The worst thing that can possibly happen is that a company gets caught, to use an analogy, with its pants down, right? So all of a sudden something happens and they didn't know about it. But I think there's enough, you seem to be saying that there's enough understanding on the part of at least large companies that they need to kind of think about it.
And in fact, more than the companies, it is the banks, because most of the infrastructure is largely funded by debt.
Right.
So banks also need to factor that in, and they're getting there. It has not been fully factored in till date, but it's getting there.
Right. So you've got to kind of company realization plus banks realization, and banks realization also giving some pressure on the companies.
Right.
Moving on to something a little bit more specific, and just to pick, we can't talk about every single sector in India. It's a big country with lots of people, like China. So maybe we just focus on 3 sectors: cement, steel, and power. Mm-hmm. So on the cement front, cement is one of those sectors where decarbonization is generally brutal, because so much of the carbon comes from the chemistry of making clinker, not just from burning fuel. How are Indian cement majors like, Ultratech or Shree Cement actually approaching that problem? And is there a credible technology path here?
Interesting question, because we have engaged with a few cement companies and we know the predicament which they're currently facing. So cement is, you're right, is probably one of the hardest transition story, because unlike power, you can't simply replace one fuel with another, because 60% emission comes from the clinker chemical process. Even if they have 100% renewable energy, they would still be emitting a lot of carbon. And when we are looking at what the companies are saying in the annual report, what the companies are telling us, So they basically have taken a more portfolio approach. They haven't taken a single bullet solution to the problem. So they are talking about improving the thermal efficiency. They are talking about replacing all electricity with renewable energy, use of alternative fuel, expanding the waste heat recovery system, reducing the clinker content of cement through blended products, increasing some capital allocation towards technology like carbon capture. They talk about all those blended approach of as a portfolio. They understand the entire process can't be replaced, and at this point in time, there is no visible solution they have for that. So when I would say to an investor is that when you're looking at the company, look at where is the company capital is being allocated. Are they looking for solutions? Are they putting their money towards the production, reducing the carbon production every year? Or they're simply waiting for that magic solution for which will come one day. We find at least the major cement companies are working in that direction. And we feel that while it may not be a single short answer to the transition, but our expectation is that in a gradual way, the cement will find its own bearing and they would be able to, because that's the intent which they have already stated. And they're demonstrating through incremental capital allocation, at least the low-hanging fruits they're addressing as early as they can. So I think cement is the hardest one, but at the same time, I am more positive about it, and we will see some changes in years to come.
Understood. Steel is in a similar position, right? Now, green hydrogen-based steelmaking sounds exciting concept, but the economics look very different in India compared to, say, Sweden or Germany. What realistic transition is available to companies like, I don't know, just to pick some names, Tata Steel, GSW, in the near to medium term?
I mean, in this case of India, very often the conversation about decarbonization, they still don't jump to straight to green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is something which they have put some capital on, but that is not a solution. They're looking at it in the next few years. So they're looking at the issues like how can they replace the blast furnace with the electric arc furnace, but they are facing a challenge. There is no scrap availability in India. So they're trying to address those issues. Or low-hanging fruit again, replacing all electricity from fossil to renewable energy source, improving energy efficiency. Again, they're taking a more portfolio approach. But at the same time, wherever they think that there's a possibility of putting the capital, they're also deploying the capital. So Indian companies are going to face the challenge because Indian steel production is going to more than double in next 5 years. So it's very important to understand that the production doubling at a very high cost may not be the possibility in the Indian market. Of course, there is a CBAM impact and they will be feeling the pressure for it. But they are doing everything they can do within their powers to the extent they are commercially viable to make the steel which they are producing more and more green. There's also a policy side. The government of India has come out with a green steel taxonomy. They have rated the steel with a carbon emission with 1 star to 5 star. So 5 star is very ambitious, but Indian average CO2 emission of steel production is very high. There's also a disclosure issue which currently is not there. So gradually, those are the issues which they're trying to address. And the larger companies are working on it much more than probably the smaller ones. But this is a story which is currently evolving and we are seeing change. It will not be that straightforward and quick, but we see that happening over a period of maybe a next decade or so.
So the Indian steel capacity doubling over the next 5 years, that's pretty much fixed because I presume the companies have already stated the plans, et cetera, right? So it's not a wish list. Well, that's really massive.
Yeah, I mean,
that is really massive.
Huge annual capex for each of the large major steel companies which we are covering. So obviously these larger companies are going to put in a huge amount of additional capacity. A few companies have already announced it. We are not seeing all of that going towards greener steel because they think that the demand is still not there. But as the demand picks up, probably. So I would say when is the last coal-based blast furnace they will be installing? That is something which is a wish list from our perspective. But at the same time, we have to kind of go with the flow. The low-hanging fruits are being captured, but the more difficult things still remains to be done.
Right. And obviously, competitiveness is a key factor. The power sector sits at the center of everyone else's decarbonization story, because you can't have green cement or steel without greener electricity. How are India's large power producers thinking about stranded asset risk on their coal fleets? And is anyone actually building that into financial planning?
So, yeah, you're right. Power transition story is central to everything because because one of the lowest hanging fruit, both steel and cement are talking about is changing from fossil based electricity to green electricity. And the good news there is, of course, the cost of green electricity has come down. Solar has been the dominant, but we are talking about now round the clock renewable energy, which includes a lot of storage, battery, pump hydro, maybe small hydro, small nuclear reactors. We don't know. So, but the solution which we talked about is around the clock renewable energy. That is something which is cost effective. So when we look at the cost economics of round the clock renewable energy versus the new coal-based plants, our assessment at ARE is that the future new coal-based plant are likely to be more expensive than the round-the-clock RE. But the challenge is base loading because there has been a shortage post the solar hour. There have been challenges from the pure renewable energy. When as the solar hour goes away, there is a huge demand spike, and that can be only be met through either coal or gas, which is currently coal will continue to be the story in India for some more time. But we have a huge existing coal fleet, which will continue to provide that particular. So government of India has announced 80,000 megawatt for additional coal to be put in next 5-6 years. My assessment or our assessment is that probably will not happen because cost economics is changing very fast. Only few companies are now putting coal capex, so NTPC, Adani, JSW. And most of them are also, when we look at individual company level capex, even NTPC is putting 2/3 capex in renewable energy. So coal capex has significantly come down. And we don't see that kind of a coal-based capacity addition, which will happen in India. But at the same time, because of the base loading issue, coal will continue to be the story which government will continue to support. So some more years, we are at the point where China was in 2015, when say 76% of the supply used to come from coal. China today is less than 50%. I think the same story will, or maybe in a fast track, they will repeat itself in India. We'll see a much higher share of renewable energy. So capacity-wise, India today is 55% renewable capacity. So total installed capacity. But in energy terms, it is still 25-30%. We expect that to go above 50% over next decade.
Right. Moving on to some kind of finance-related questions. Carbon finance keeps getting talked up as a way of making transition projects actually bankable for hard-to-abate sectors like steel and cement. But given how volatile and frankly unreliable carbon credits revenues have been globally, do you think that Indian industry can generally build a credible financing case around carbon markets, or is it just too shaky a foundation to anchor real investment decisions on?
I think, India is going to start the carbon market very soon. So carbon market do have a role to play, but only on the margins. I think in some cases where technologies are very expensive and they can add some marginal revenue to it, maybe that will be used. But to be very realistic, using carbon market as a way of billions of dollars of investment will happen. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. Because as you said yourself, the market has been very volatile. Investors are not going to take a long-term call on carbon prices. Carbon prices at best will be considered as a short-term 1 or 2 year revenue stream, maybe a little longer, but at a much lower prices. So I think major decisions of investment and capital allocation will depend entirely on the commercial consideration of the particular technology, maturity of the technology, the overall returns which the technology or the project will provide. So I think that's where the current situation is. But if the carbon markets were to become stable and globally connected and more credible, because one of the issues of the carbon market is also the carbon accounting credibility.
Yes.
So all those things put together, I mean, I don't see that happening very soon. But if that were to happen, then possibly that can be seen as an additional source of revenue. But at this point in time, most of the investment decisions are taken more from a commercial consideration perspective rather than from a carbon market revenue perspective. It's an add-on revenue for any company.
Right. The reason I started our kind of finance conversation with carbon is because I think it is a very useful extra tool for financing. I think some people are overly optimistic, saying that's going to be the ultimate tool. But I think the more tools we have, financing tools we have, the better it is. So that's really where I was coming from, Arun. Now, financing is often cited as the big constraint, but India has attracted enormous amount of renewable energy investments. Is the real bottleneck capital, or is it something else like policy certainty, technology availability, or just organizational will inside these companies?
Used to be a constraint, but I think now it's no more a constraint. It's more about investable projects. So, I mean, you're right, India has attracted almost all large major RE companies, and they have put in projects. There have been interest from all kinds of funds, pension funds, sovereign funds, wealth funds. They've all put in money here in this renewable energy.
Right.
We have seen pre-IPO funding. I mean, there have been many deals based on renewable companies. Recently, we saw a large company set up by some funds bought by JSW Energy called O2, a huge valuation. So capital has not been a constraint, but what is the constraint is the right investment projects, which is seen as commercially profitable. I wouldn't say just viable, but profitable. So if the project is commercially profitable, if the project can give returns, there is absolutely no constraint of funding from multiple sources, both domestic and international. I mean, one of the factors which has helped the renewable cost come down has been the large inflow of funding, and that has led to the scale, which has given the renewable sector that kind of cost economics to bring the cost down. And the future projection for the cost is only downwards at this point in time. So while the renewable energy cost curve is a falling cost curve, I think the coal cost curve is a rising cost curve at this point in time, from whatever we're looking at it. So if you're looking for the future investment in a renewable project versus a coal project, I can tell you that 5 years' time, the cost curve for a renewable project is going to be declining, while cost of the energy from a coal project is going to be increasing. So you're looking at a falling cost curve, second, you're looking at a rising cost curve. But this is the situation in power. In steel and cement, the challenge is slightly different. As we talked earlier, it's about technologies. It's about proven technologies like clinkers.
Yes.
Is there any option to clinker? Is there any option to blast furnace-based steel making in India? So there are other technologies which is being used, DRI and other technologies, which is less carbon intensive, but it is not fully the green as the green is defined. So technology, the R&D issue, then the proven technology issues there in the hard-to-abate sectors like steel, cement, and a few more. But some sectors have taken off, like autos have taken off. We didn't talk about autos, but autos have taken off in a way. But at the same time, autos have other problems, like logistic problem, charging, and battery issues, battery costs. So I think the capital will flow. Capital is not the constraint. The constraint is, are there enough investable projects which an investor can invest with a fair degree of return expectations on that project? So that's something which is now becoming the main story rather than people saying, oh, where is the money going to come from?
In some markets around Southeast Asia, as you know, Arun, you've seen corporate power purchasing agreements, CCPAs, kind of like increasing. What's the state today of CPPAs in India?
No, that's been there in India. In fact, what we call is C&I customers in India, commercial and industrial customers. So basically, as per the regulation in India, any consumer with more than 1 megawatt of load can buy power directly from a generator. Don't have to go through the distribution company. And for RE power, for renewable energy power, that threshold is reduced to 100 kilowatts, so which is very small. And most of the companies which have larger facilities have their own either captive power plant or buying from third source in a what's called group captive mode. So one power plant, say 100 megawatt solar, can be supplying to 3 or 4 commercial and industrial customers. That's been pretty mature in India, very much being used. And some of the data centers, for example, have signed direct PPAs. We also have other instruments like virtual power plants, where some of these large technology, virtual VPP, virtual power purchase agreement. So basically, the modus operandi of that is that Google or a Microsoft or an Apple has signed a PPA with a renewable energy generator, and they're selling that power into the grid without any direct consumption. They are not direct consumers. They're basically selling that power through the power exchange and the differential. So if I have a PPA of say 3 rupees and I'm able to sell that power exchange at 2 rupees, let's say, the differential is borne by a Google or a Microsoft. So they have actually they are virtual consumers of green energy. That's also happening. That's been extensively used, and that is basically to earn the green attributes. So these are some of the instruments which has led to this kind of a capacity addition. India last year added 54,000 megawatt, of which 90% was green. So that's capacity addition which is happening mainly, and part of that is driven by the corporate PPAs.
Very interesting. We talked a little bit about banks before, and when you look at Indian commercial banks lending to sectors like cement, steel, and power, how confident are you that they are actually pricing transition risk into those lending decisions in any meaningful way? Or does it still feel like climate risk is something that sits in a kind of sustainability report rather than a credit committee conversation?
I think we are, let's be in the early days. We are moving in the right direction. We had the recent interaction with a few banks, one meeting with the ESG team. We also attended a few AGMs. From there you get a feel of what the banks are thinking, what is the management saying. There was no discussion of that ESG in the AGM for some of the largest bank in India. So we realized, especially the public sector bank, the government banks, because one of the mandate which the banks have been given is develop India, Viksit Bharat by 2047. So India becoming a developed country by 2047 is a mandate which the banks have been given. And they cannot really not fund projects which could be high earners, but at the same time not so ESG or environment friendly. But at the same time, having said that, it has changed. So while it was earlier treated more like an ESG reporting thing, so you are doing some sustainability reporting and some CSR initiative, but now we are seeing gradually more interest among the banks. So for example, some banks are saying, can you help us prepare a decarbonization roadmap for us? Can you help us create a sectoral roadmap for decarbonization? So those things, which is new, which is not something which has been there for last many years, but last 1 or 2 years, we are seeing that being factored in. We're also in touch with the central bank, Reserve Bank of India. They are also in the process of introducing climate risk as a part of the credit risk. And many of the private banks already have a team in place for factoring that climate risk as a part of the credit risk evaluation process. But because banking is mostly regulated, so central bank has to define the roadmap which a bank will move. And central bank is in the process. Government of India has issued a draft green taxonomy, because that's also important. What is green and what is not green is what has to be defined. Right. And they're in the process of issuing the final green taxonomy. So from a government side, while the green taxonomy is going to be issued, the Reserve Bank of India is going to introduce a platform through which the banks can access directly in incorporating climate risk as a part of that risk evaluation process. Banks have the ESG teams, and gradually I think that will get incorporated. Private banks will do faster than the state-run banks, but I think the process is moving in the right direction. It will take a little longer than, say, the steel and cement or power has taken.
Right. So it's kind of like a work in progress, but progressing relatively rapidly.
Rapidly, yeah. Last 1 year, so since I've been working with the area for like 40 months, and when I met first RBI, say 1 year back, these discussions were still very early stages. Now, every time I go and meet them, we see some progress. So we're seeing progress. We're seeing incrementally direction is moving in the right direction. And the recent energy crisis actually helped that matter also. It has helped the process move a little faster. And I think that's the good news, is that now technology risk of green is no more seen as a risk. It is more seen as inevitable, that whether it's the only question is the when. It's not a question of should we do it or not do it. It could be the timing issue. It could be that I may wait for another year, but it is not about not doing it.
Moving more on the outlooks kind of thing, looking ahead 5 or 10 years, which sector do you think will surprise people the most in terms of how far it has moved on decarbonization? And conversely, where are you most worried that the gap between ambition and reality will be impossible to close, or very difficult to close?
I think one of the things which is going to happen in a very recent future will be cross-border power market development. Because I was recently at Asia Clean Energy Forum at ADB Manila, and ADB is funding some of these power market in the regional context. One of the factors which challenge with RE is that RE is intermittent. The solar comes at a certain hour, wind comes at a certain hour. You have to have storage, but at the same time, there could be complementary power exchange between regions. For example, Nepal is a country north of India, has a huge hydro potential. But during those winter months, they have a power shortage. India can supply that. In the summer months, India has actually has been buying power from Nepal and Bhutan, just to give you an example. Similar things in the ASEAN region. They're also talking about similar things in Central Asia. So I think more cross-country power market development is likely to happen. The discussion, the infrastructure creation, ASEAN grid project investment is already on the table. How soon that will happen, we don't know. So we think that the cross-border power market was something which will, and that is more required from a renewable energy, deepening of renewable energy uses in these countries. Smaller countries on their own may not be able to absorb everything which they generate because renewable energy is nature says. So we see that, and I would expect in next 10 years, that would be a different, significant positive development in this cross-country power market. And three particular regions, I think, which will happen is South Asia, which is already there, ASEAN and Central Asia. You can also see some of that in Africa. I'm not very familiar with that, but we have been hearing about some of these regional in Africa also talking about that. Europe already has a pan-European power market. So you'll see that happen. Also, another area which I've been seeing and hearing from experts is that hydrogen and carbon capture, and possibly the nuclear SMR, small modular reactor. Because there also, again, I heard from the Director General of International Atomic Energy, he is saying that we have reduced the R&D to commercialization of SMRs. We have reduced all the risks, and we are factoring that in. So there is a lot of investment and work being done on that, SMRs also. So these three technologies, hydrogen, carbon capture, and SMRs, are something which I would think that could be very important even for hard-to-abate sectors like cement and steel, because SMRs apparently can also provide, you are not that familiar with the technology, but they can also provide you both heat as well as electricity. So this will basically solve a lot of blast furnace-related issues from some of these sectors. So I think these three technologies are on way to, because there is money being put on the table. And we'll see that maturing into commercially usable technology. I don't know about how much commercially profitable, but definitely commercially usable technology. And I would be worried if I'm a coal miner or a manufacturer of BTG equipment or any of these, because I see that cost economics seriously going against them. It's not about world wanting to be clean. It's more about cost economics. And I think the cost economics is clearly moving against them, and we would not see that. I mean, there's already a BTG shortage because one of the Indian utilities wanted to put up a coal-based plant. They were told by the BTG manufacturer the waiting period for supply is 3 years. because they have stopped manufacturing BTG. There is no capacity addition. And that is something which is probably going to face the biggest challenge in next decade. Definitely it will be a really hard to really see that continuing at the same pace.
Very, very, very interesting. Before we let you go, Arun, on the lighter side of the conversations, do you have any personal recommendations to our listeners? I mean, it could be books, reports, films, documentaries, or anything which has caught your eye, or anything. Anything
I love books. I love books. So one of the books I recently picked up, which I'm reading currently, is called Climate Capitalism, written by Akshat Rathi, an Indian. It's a 2023 written book. It captures some of the ground level evidence of how transition is unfolding. He's captured the story of China EV and battery, solar and wind becoming more cheaper, and some of these insight and reform in cement, oil. So he's actually, he's a venture capitalist and capturing some of these good projects which have become certainly viable, which nobody thought initially. It's a very good book to read. I'll recommend anyone who loves actual ground level investment turning to be commercially viable. So that's the book I'm reading. I have another book, I don't know, it's slightly political, but I have it on my desk, is the book written by the current Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Henry. It's basically geopolitics. It's basically what he says. I have not read the book, but the premise is that finance in future will flow towards what society really truly values. It will not be purely based on the commercial situation. So geopolitics and the capital allocation will shape the future. AI, of course, is something which you're seeing data center demand coming up. And hopefully that will drive more and more green demand, green energy demand. And we'll see that happen. So these were two books which I would recommend to you. Geopolitics is important to understand before you think what will happen next.
Those are really great recommendations, Arun, and I will put that in my reading list. I want to really, really thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Always enjoy very, very much speaking to you, and thank you so much for all of your insights, Arun.
Thank you, Joseph, and it's a pleasure always speaking to you and connecting back with you. Thank you so much for inviting me to your podcast. Thank you so much.
Please note that the Asia Climate Finance podcast is provided for educational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice. Any information discussed should not be relied upon for making investment decisions. Listeners should always seek advice from a suitably qualified and authorized investment professional. The views and opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of their current or former employers or of the podcast host or producers.